us now, the host of MSNBC's Hardball, Chris Matthews. He's live from Texas Southern University in Houston, where he will be hosting tonight's live town hall event, Obama's America 2010 and Beyond, looking at the questions with that. Also with us in the studio, Mark Morial. He's the president and CEO of the National Urban League and the former mayor of New Orleans. Chris, let's start, though, with the big political story of the day, of the week, of the year, potentially, and that's in Massachusetts. What's your take on what's going to go down there?
Well, I just talked to David Paleologos, who's the pollster for Suffolk University, who's been conducting that poll that's grabbed so much attention, and he said that the bellwether areas last night were double-digit for brown, so it looks like brown.
Oh,
now, there's snow. There's a lot of snow up in Massachusetts right now. But if the bellwethers are double-digit for brown, that's
Chris,
the game's over.
What does that mean
weather
when you talk about the bellwethers? Talk about, again, the Suffolk University poll that you're mentioning had brown up 4 or 5 points a few days ago. You talked to him again last night. What do you mean by the bellwethers?
Well, I just talked to him a minute ago. He was out polling late last night. You look at the communities that basically are little Massachusetts, little mini Massachusetts, and then you go by that as an example of what's going on statewide. Of course, this is all the state of the art. I mean, this is what you try to do in any polling situation. And of course, with a special election, you're never sure who's actually going to vote. But based upon the usual techniques of polling, looking at key areas, at bellwether areas, it looks like brown.
Chris, and you said by double digits, this could be one of those races, if in fact the pollster's right that you talked to a few minutes ago, where you just have momentum going in one direction and no president, no politician, no ad campaign can stop it. Is that what you sense?
Yeah, and Joe, you and I talk politics all the time. It looks to me that I always go by a simple rule. You look at Thursday before an election and you project from there. I don't see people changing their minds. This election, people know what they're voting for. They're voting against the health care bill. They're not voting against the president. What stunned me in the New York Times is looking at the fact that among people who are favorable personally to the president, even among that group, they're against Coakley. So she's much less popular than the president. She's certainly not a good campaigner. But, you know, Mike Barnicle knows the whole thing. This goes back to the Ed King Democrats. You know, the Kennedys, Jack Kennedy being brought in basically to support Scott Brown as an iconic figure, a tax cutter. I think it's so interesting that crosswinds in this election. Very interesting.
This is fascinating. Mike Barnicle, does that surprise you? Double digits in bellwether areas last night?
There are 3 keys to understanding this special election in Massachusetts. Route 2 heads west out of Boston. Route 9 heads west towards Worcester out of Boston. Route 16 heads southwest out of Boston into towns like Attleboro, Worcester, Fitchburg, Leominster. Huge brown territory, having less to do with the fact that he's a Republican or an independent or a conservative, and that he is against the existing order. He's against the establishment.
And really,
I would have said 495, and you'd probably...
This is it.
That whole 495 corridor.
And Chris Matthews, what's so fascinating here is, and I really do think, and again, I'll get hammered by Republicans, but this is the reality. I think one of the great dangers of this race, it will be an earthquake. It will be the biggest Republican victory since Bush won in 2004. But what's happening here is Scott Brown is winning not because of Washington Republicans, but in spite of Washington Republicans. There is no existing establishment in D.C. that's relevant to the Republican Party, and yet he's still winning.
The brilliance is exactly right, and the fact that he's campaigned in these last few hours without any Republicans around him. Well, there aren't many up here anyway, in Massachusetts anyway. But it's also interesting that nobody knows who John Boehner is. Nobody knows who Mitch McConnell is. The more these guys become meek, I mean, they're sort of Mr. Peepers types. They're like, you know, milquetoast guys. You know, nobody knows who they are, even likes them. But that doesn't seem to hurt Republicans because people are voting Brand X. They're voting anything but. By the way, if you're a Massachusetts voter, and Mike knows this, and you say you're independent, that means you're not a Democrat. That's a statement in itself. You don't want to be seen as a Democrat. Why not? That's the key question. Why don't you want to be a Democrat? And that's what this election's about. You don't want taxes. You don't want big government. You love the Kennedys. You love Jack especially. You're romantic about politics. But this election's interesting. I don't even know what religion seems to play no role in this election, which is so unique in Massachusetts. Brown is a Protestant. Nobody's even mentioned it. I guess I just did. And Coakley's, I guess, a Catholic, although I don't think that she sort of of squares away that way in terms of her politics. So, I mean, it's just so interesting. It's so post-tribal. And yet he goes back to being anti-elite and Ed King Democrat. There's so much in it I recognize. And the fact she didn't know that Schilling was a Red Sox, I mean, I don't get it. I mean, how do these people get so far?
All right, let's get Mark Morial in here.
How do you not know the basics?
Mr. Mayor,
How do you not?
Yes.
We were talking about this.
Catholics
and again,
shouldn't work in emergency rooms? I mean, how do you make statements like you shouldn't work in an emergency room if you have a conscience about abortion? I mean, how do you make statements like that?
She also, Mr. Mayor, let me ask you, and Chris is bringing up another statement that she said that if you're a devout Catholic that's pro-life, you shouldn't work in emergency rooms. She certainly sounds tone deaf, doesn't she?
Well, you know, all politics is local, and this is what you see happening is an example of a race that turns on sometimes the personalities of the candidates. It turns on the timing of the election taking place in the middle of January while there's a debate going on a big piece of legislation. So I think it's a reflection of the fact that all politics is still local. And it turns on those sorts of things. But it's important as people prognosticate about elections, though, that we understand that the election is tomorrow and that the polls are polls, and they are many times accurate.
Let's remember New Hampshire. Barack Obama ahead by 10, 11 percentage points in New Hampshire the morning of the election, and he lost.
So I think it's very important. I always question the wisdom of the timing of special elections, which tend to get a lower voter turnout, which tend to be driven by, quote unquote, who can get their voters to the polls. And I don't think it's in the best interest always to have special elections, although they're occasioned by, in this case, the death of Senator Kennedy.
Yeah, exactly. Chris Matthews also, and you'll know this as well, if I were setting up as a Democrat a worse time to have a special election, I would be hard-pressed to find a Tuesday in January in an off-year election after a 3-day weekend. In a recession, unemployment at 10% right now, because the reality is, and we saw this in the 2009 elections, in off-year elections, voters are older and they are wider. And this is, again, things that are going to play in the favor of the Republican.
You know, Joe, let's bring in the whole health care issue, because if Brown wins tomorrow, it will be really, in many ways, a death knell for health care, basically, according to the current scenario. I mean, you may come up, Mark may be right, you may come up with some other way of doing it past the Senate bill, although you got the Stupak problem. I don't know how you do that. But here's the interesting thing. If you're a senior citizen and you already have federally sponsored health care, financed health care, you have Medicare, you don't need this bill. If you're about to be a senior citizen, you don't need it. If you're working and have health care, you don't need it. If you live in Massachusetts, they already have a health care plan that was backed by Ted Kennedy. So if you vote for Coakley, you're voting for a national health care plan on top of all that, which you have to pay for. So you're going to subsidize something for somebody else, basically. So who are you counting on to vote in this election? There is nobody, because even the poor people in Massachusetts, or the working poor, they're getting health care through the state now. Nobody benefits up there by voting the Democratic line this time. It's a perfect storm for disaster. And then you throw in the fact, who wants to say yes, keep it going to the way things are going right now? Who wants to say, great work, establishment, I just love this government. I just love the people running it.
Where the argument, I think where the argument about health care has, in fact, become cloudy is, how do people who do have insurance today benefit? Now, I can tell you that premiums have dramatically increased. Our own organization, where we provide health care, we've seen almost a doubling in premiums in the last decade alone. So that's where the argument has become cloudy, and the voters and the people who have insurance don't quite clearly at this point, I think, see how it benefits them. One of the things that's persuaded me to support it has been the fact that there needs to be pressure downward on insurance premiums for people who have insurance today. And that's a very important part of this, not only covering those who are uncovered.
Chris, tell us about your event tonight.
Mr. Mayor, he hasn't sold it that way. He has, unfortunately, just to make the point, he hasn't sold it that way. It's not seen as a reform bill. It's seen as a big government bill, and that's the problem. You know, tonight we're going to try to talk about something really big. We're here at at Texas Southern University in Houston, Texas. We're going to have a big crowd here with Tom Joyner from Dallas, the talk show host. It's going to be a largely African-American crowd. We're going to talk about a year after Obama was elected with all the promise that came with it. And I think there's still a lot of promise. There are a lot of it. And we're going to talk about that tonight with a very excited crowd. It's going to be great television on MSNBC for 2 hours.
All right, Chris Matthews.
Can't wait,
we look
Chris.
forward to that. We'll be watching. Thank you very much.
Please
Mark
watch.
Morial, thank you as well.
Mr. Mayor,
Great to see
go
you.
Saints,
My
baby.
pleasure. Go Saints.
Good item
All
to
the
show
way.
for me.
Till they play the Jets. Go ahead.
Let me tell you something. I'm a Jets and a Giants fan until they play the Saints.
Okay, well, we got that
Okay.
backwards.